Something massive is unfolding across the Middle East right now, and Washington is calling it decisive. But here's what the Pentagon press briefings won't tell you. When empires announce a decisive end, they're rarely talking about peace. They're talking about control. Iranian strikes rippling across the region aren't happening in a vacuum. They're the visible surface of a much deeper tectonic shift, one that's been building beneath the surface of collapsing dollar hegemony, fracturing alliances, and a multipolar world that refuses to wait for American permission to exist. The United States is promising finality, but the ancient civilizations of this region have outlasted every empire that made that same promise. What you're watching right now isn't just military conflict, it's a live recalibration of global power. Who holds it, who's losing it, and who's quietly positioning for the world that comes after. Pay close attention because history doesn't pause for commercial breaks. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning that CNN or Fox News will give you, but the real beginning. The one that starts not with a missile launch or a drone strike, but with decades of accumulated pressure, broken agreements, unilateral sanctions, and a foreign policy architecture built entirely on the assumption that the United States could indefinitely dictate the terms of existence for nations on the other side of the planet. That is the context. And without that context, everything you're seeing right now looks random. It isn't random. Nothing in geopolitics is ever random. Iran didn't wake up one morning and decide to destabilize a region. That framing, the one you get from think tanks funded by defense contractors and television anchors who've never set foot in Tehran, is a framing designed to erase history. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been living under an economic siege for over 4 decades. 4 decades of sanctions, of covert operations, of assassinated nuclear scientists, of a CIA-backed coup that goes all the way back to 1953, when Mohammad Mossadegh dared to nationalize Iranian oil, and Washington decided that was simply unacceptable. You have to understand that history if you want to understand today, because Iran remembers. The collective memory of a civilization that is over 2,000 years old doesn't forget what happened in the 20th century. And it absolutely doesn't forget what's been happening in the 21st. Now let's talk about what's actually being reported. Strikes across the region, multiple theaters of engagement, and the United States promising what it always promises in these moments, a decisive end. Think about how many times you've heard that phrase in your lifetime, decisive end. In Afghanistan, they promised a decisive end. 20 years later, the Taliban was back in Kabul, and American military contractors had made hundreds of billions of dollars in the process. In Iraq, they promised a decisive end to Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction, weapons that never existed. And what they delivered instead was the complete dismemberment of an ancient state, the unleashing of sectarian chaos, and the birth of ISIS. In Libya, they promised a decisive end to Gaddafi's government, and what followed was a failed state with open slave markets. So when Washington uses the phrase decisive end in 2024 and beyond, you are fully within your rights as a thinking human being to ask, decisive end for whom and toward what actual objective? Because here is what the serious analysts, the ones not embedded with the Pentagon, are telling you. This isn't simply about Iran acting alone. What you're witnessing is the activation of what has been called the axis of resistance. This is a strategic network that includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various militia forces in Iraq and Syria, and Iran as the central coordinating power. This network didn't assemble overnight. It was built over years, precisely in response to American and Israeli military dominance in the region. It was built as a deterrent, and deterrents, by definition, only have meaning when they are actually deployed. What the Western media presents as aggression is, from the perspective of these actors, a long overdue response to decades of accumulated aggression directed at them. Let's talk about Yemen for a moment, because the Houthis, or Ansarallah, as they call themselves, have become one of the most remarkable military and political stories of the 21st century, and almost no one in mainstream American media is giving you an honest account of it. Here is a movement that has withstood nearly a decade of Saudi-led bombing, a bombing campaign that the United States actively supported with intelligence, refueling, and weapons sales. The civilian casualty numbers in Yemen are catastrophic. The infrastructure destruction is total. And yet Ansarallah not only survived, it expanded its territorial control. It developed sophisticated drone and missile technology, and it is now actively interdicting commercial shipping in the Red Sea, one of the most critical maritime trade corridors on the planet. That is not the behavior of a defeated force. That is the behavior of a movement that has been forged in the fire of total war and emerged with a completely different strategic calculus than the one Washington was counting on. And the Red Sea situation is enormously important because it directly connects the military dimension to the economic dimension. And this is where the story gets much bigger than just missiles and airstrikes. When Houthi operations began disrupting Red Sea shipping, major container shipping companies started rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. That adds weeks to shipping times and enormous costs. It directly impacts global supply chains. It raises the price of goods. It affects insurance rates for maritime shipping worldwide. This is a small, non-state actor in one of the poorest countries on earth, directly impacting the economics of global trade. Let that sink in for a moment, because what it tells you is something that the architects of American foreign policy are struggling to process. And the old model of power projection, where you bomb a poor country into submission and it stays submitted, is no longer functioning as advertised. Now, let's zoom out further, because the Iranian dimension of this story cannot be understood without understanding the broader realignment that is happening at the level of great power competition. China and Russia are not passive observers of what's happening in the Middle East. They have deep structural interests in the outcome. China gets a massive percentage of its oil from the Gulf region. The Belt and Road Initiative runs through this geography. Iran is now a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is part of the BRICS expansion. Russia and Iran have deepened their military and economic cooperation significantly since 2022, when the war in Ukraine forced Moscow to look east and south for partnerships that could withstand Western sanctions pressure. What you are watching in the Middle East is not an isolated regional conflict. It is one theater of a much larger global restructuring, a restructuring in which the unipolar American moment, that brief window between the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of China, is coming to an end. Washington understands this. The national security apparatus understands this, the think tanks understand this, and the response, rather than a serious strategic rethinking, has largely been to double down on military solutions to what are fundamentally political and economic problems. You can bomb a missile launcher. You cannot bomb a geopolitical idea whose time has come. The idea that nations in the global south have the right to determine their own political and economic futures without seeking permission from Washington or Brussels, that idea is spreading. It is spreading in Africa, where coup after coup is being followed by the expulsion of French and American military presences. It is spreading in Latin America. It is spreading in Southeast Asia. And it is absolutely spreading in the Middle East, where the Abraham Accords, that grand normalization project that was supposed to lock in American-Israeli dominance of the regional order, are looking increasingly fragile in the wake of what has happened in Gaza. And we have to talk about Gaza, because it is impossible to understand the current escalation without understanding what has been happening in Gaza. The scale of destruction in that territory has been witnessed by the entire world in real time, through social media, through satellite imagery, through the testimony of journalists and aid workers on the ground. The images have reached every phone screen in the Arab and Muslim world. They have reached screens in Tehran and in Sana'a and in Beirut and in Baghdad, and they have fundamentally transformed the political calculus of every actor in this region. For Iran, for Hezbollah, for the Houthis, inaction in the face of what is being witnessed in Gaza was not a sustainable political position. Their constituencies, their populations were demanding a response. And so a response came. You cannot separate the current escalation from that context. To try to do so is to deliberately blind yourself to the most important causal factor on the table. Now, what does the United States actually want here? That question sounds simple, but the answer is genuinely complicated, because there isn't a single unified American interest. There are multiple competing interests operating simultaneously. The defense industry wants conflict to continue because conflict generates contracts. The financial sector wants stability because instability disrupts markets and investment flows. The political class wants to appear strong and decisive heading into election cycles. The intelligence community has its own long-term regional objectives that don't always align with what the White House is saying publicly. And then there are the genuine strategic interests, maintaining access to Gulf energy resources, ensuring the security of Israel, preventing any single regional power from achieving hegemony over Middle Eastern oil. These interests are not always compatible with each other, and the result is often a foreign policy that looks incoherent because it actually is incoherent. It's the product of multiple competing bureaucratic and financial interests pulling in different directions simultaneously. What Iran is doing, and this is the strategic sophistication that rarely gets acknowledged, is exploiting exactly that incoherence. Iran is not trying to win a direct military confrontation with the United States. It knows it cannot win that confrontation on purely conventional military terms. What Iran is doing is raising the cost of American regional dominance to a level that makes it politically and economically unsustainable over time. Every Houthi drone that forces an American carrier group to expend $1 million interceptor missile to shoot it down is a calculated exchange. Every disruption to Red Sea shipping is a calculated cost imposition. Every militia attack on American bases in Iraq and Syria is a signal that says the era of cost-free American power projection in this region is over. This is a strategy of attrition, not annihilation. And historically, strategies of attrition against overextended empires have a remarkably good track record. Let's also think about what a so-called decisive American response actually looks like in practice, because the gap between the rhetoric and the reality is vast. Striking Iranian proxy infrastructure, as has already happened repeatedly, does not eliminate the proxies. It may degrade their capacity temporarily, but these are deeply embedded, ideologically motivated movements with genuine popular support in their respective communities. You cannot bomb an ideology into non-existence. You cannot drone strike a political grievance into irrelevance. The Houthis have been bombed by one of the most advanced military coalitions in the world for nearly a decade, and they are more capable today than they were when the bombing started. That is a data point that should force a serious rethinking of the entire approach, and yet the institutional momentum within the American national security establishment pushes relentlessly toward the same toolkit: more strikes, more sanctions, more pressure, even when the evidence of the last 20 years makes clear that these tools are not delivering the intended outcomes. Meanwhile, the economic dimensions are accelerating in ways that directly affect ordinary Americans, and this is where the geopolitical becomes intensely personal. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency has been the single greatest source of American economic power since Bretton Woods. It allows the United States to run deficits that would cripple any other country. It gives Washington the ability to impose sanctions that actually bite, because so much global trade is denominated in dollars and processed through dollar clearing systems. But that privilege is being systematically eroded. BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems. China and Russia are settling bilateral trade in their own currencies. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar arrangement, has been publicly discussing accepting yuan for oil sales. The conversations happening in the corridors of power in Riyadh and Beijing and Moscow right now are conversations about a post-dollar world order, and when that transition accelerates, not if, when, the economic consequences for everyday Americans will be significant and very real. Higher import prices, reduced ability of the federal government to borrow cheaply, a gradual but irreversible erosion of the financial subsidy that the reserve currency status has provided to the American consumer economy for decades. These are the downstream consequences of the geopolitical shifts being set in motion right now. The missile strikes and the drone wars are the visible, dramatic surface of a much deeper transformation in the architecture of global power. And the transformation at that deeper level, the monetary and financial level, may ultimately prove more consequential than anything happening on any battlefield. What the American public deserves, and is largely being denied, is an honest accounting of where this trajectory leads. Not the triumphalist narrative of American power imposing a decisive end to adversary behavior. Not the demonization of Iran and its partners as purely irrational actors driven by religious fanaticism, but a genuinely honest reckoning with the fact that decades of a particular kind of foreign policy have produced a world in which American power is more contested, more resisted, and more costly to exercise than at any point since the end of the Cold War. The nations that are pushing back are not doing so because they hate freedom. They are doing so because they have concrete material interests in a different global order. An order in which their sovereignty is real, their resources belong to them, and their political choices are not subject to veto by Washington. Whether you agree with those actors or not, and you don't have to agree with everything Iran does or everything the Houthis do, you have to understand the logic driving their behavior if you want to have any hope of understanding where this is heading. And where this is heading, if the current trajectory continues, is toward a prolonged period of elevated military tension, continued economic disruption, and an accelerating restructuring of global alliances that will reshape the world your children and grandchildren inherit. That is the real story behind the headlines about Iranian attacks and American promises of decisive ends. The decisive end that is actually coming is the end of a particular era of global order, and what replaces it is being determined right now in real time through exactly the kinds of confrontations we are watching unfold across the Middle East today.